I've prayed about this a long time to see if I wanted to share this story. And it seemed like the last several weeks in Sunday school, our Sunday school lesson was telling me, you need to share your story. Now, I've given my testimony in different churches and different times before, but I wanted to make sure that God gets the glory of this. And I wanted to share some, not only the salvation experience that God gave me, but also some events that God allowed me to stay, and He's got something for me to do. Growing up, my family, we didn't go to church, and it was just not something that my family did. And when I was 16 years old, I remember I was in junior high, and this senior came to me and asked me to go to church at a revival with them. And that excited me enough, a senior asking me as a junior to go to church with him. So I went to the revival, and that was probably the first time I really had an experience of being in church. Sherry and I got married in 1969. Neither one of us were Christians at that time. We didn't really realize how important it was for us to be Christians to make a marriage work. Now, God has blessed us 48 years of a marriage. And so God always, if we'll allow Him, He will intervene. She started going to the church, and we had 2 children at this time. And they asked me to go every Sunday, and I always had an excuse or a reason not to go. And then one Sunday, our oldest daughter, who was only 6 years old, had gotten saved. So oldest daughter got saved, and she would come in every Sunday morning and ask me to go to church with them. And I'd again come up with more excuses. And then Sherry got saved, and I went to see her to be baptized. Well, I got to the point where I started drinking. And I would come in wee in the hours after midnight, after working 14 hours at the nursery. I would go out drinking and everything. And I would come in, not see any of the kids, and not see Sherry. And then I'd be gone again the next day. And this went on for several weeks, several months, that I would come in late at night and drinking. Well, there was this one night I came home and the door was locked. Well, that made me mad first. And having drinking, I was ready to tear the door off of the wall. But the door opened up, and I'll never forget. Sherry said, "Kenny, we're going to live for the Lord in this house, with you or without you." So when she shut that door on me, that made me even madder. And I remember just going back to the car and driving down and finding the closest hotel or motel that I could. And I checked in, and I was determined not to go back home. Well, I was staying in that hotel a night or two, and I picked up a newspaper, a local newspaper there in Whitehaven. And the flip pages, nothing really caught my eye or nothing until I came to a certain page that it had NFL professional ball player coming to speak at Broadway Baptist Church. I can't tell you what that preacher or what that football player even spoke about. All I know was that God was getting a hold of me. And I couldn't hold it any longer. And I couldn't wait till the invitation. And I headed, the minute they did the invitation, I headed down the right side of the church, turned around and sat down in the center of the church on the front row. And the minute I sat down, there was a hand that laid up on my shoulder. And I turned around, and it was Sherry and the girls. They had sat on the second row in the middle that day, and she told me, I knew God was going to bring you here. Well, this was in May of 1978. And I'll never forget that salvation experience, that God got a hold of me and brought me there that day. And my father was in the hospital, and he had had a massive heart attack. And I had gone up to see him about 6 o'clock one morning, and he was sitting up in the bed. He had just finished eating breakfast. And the very first time that he's ever told me that he really loved me, and he told me, he says, Ken, don't mess up your life. Get it straight. And I was able to share with him that I had gotten saved and that God had control of my life now. I left there and drove about 15 miles to Mom's house, and I walked in, and they were crying. From the time I left the hospital till I got to their house, they had got the phone call that Dad had passed away. I was the last one to see him alive, and that was the last words he had said to me. So I was so thankful that God gave me that opportunity to be there with him that few minutes. Now, as I look at my life and I think of that testimony, that's what God did for me until I was saved and accepted him as my personal Savior. But you know, our real testimony is what have we done and what has God done for us and with us since we make that commitment. See, that commitment is only the first thing that we do. It's what we do with it from thereafter. The church was having a outdoor function, a horse trail ride with about 30 people that were going to ride horses. Well, I got to hurting real bad that night. This was a Saturday. Went to the doctor Monday, and they said that I needed to go see a urologist. So they set me up an appointment for Tuesday or Wednesday of that week, I don't remember which. And I went and had a bunch of tests run, CAT scan, MRI, all of that, blood work and all that. And I remember all three of the girls coming to meet with me and Sherry to hear what the doctor was going to say. Well, he come into the room after all the reports, and he said, "Ken, you've got a cancer tumor on your right kidney about the size of your fist." And he says, "We need to get it out." They wound up taking the whole kidney and everything out. And so they wanted me to come back every so 30 days, 60 days, 90 days. And so I've done that. And about 7 months later, I had a spot on the back of my neck. And I had to go to another doctor to get that checked out. Well, that wound up being cancer on my neck as well. And 5 years later, I'm cancer free. 2012, I traveled several states where I work. A couple years later, or about a year and a half later, I was traveling in Texas. And I remember I started out in San Antonio, and I had to drive out of San Antonio all the way down to the Mexican border to a meeting that I had to do Monday morning, and I knew something just wasn't right. Well, I thought, well, I got to try to make it back home. And there's about 10.5-hour trip from where I was, but I'm heading to the hospital emergency room. Amy and Clayton and Sherry drove all night long to get to the hospital, 10.5 hours away, and drove up to the emergency room side. Well, then I walked into the hospital, and the waiting room was packed with people. And I looked up and I saw this security guard, and I remember he was bald-headed, and he reminded me of Clayton. And that man brought a wheelchair out and said, "Mr. Stone, sit down in here." Now, I had just handed her my information. There's no way this guy knew what my name was. And he rushed me, he wheelchaired me, whoever it was, wheelchaired me back in the back of the emergency room. And these curtains opened up, and there was 2 doctors and 2 nurses standing there. And they immediately got me prepared. He said I'd be in and out of surgery with no problem in about 45 minutes to an hour. And when I woke up in the recovery, it was 10:30 that night. What had happened, my gallbladder had exploded on me. And he said if I had not come in to the hospital that night, they would have found me in the hotel dead. And so it took them 4.5 hours to do the surgery. God was with me there. And I've been back to that hospital, and nobody knows of any bald-headed security guy that would have wheeled me back. They have no recollection of that at all. God had sent an angel there, and he was there taking care of me. And in 2015, he said my heart rate was over 300. And he said, you're going straight to the emergency room. He said that I'd had a heart attack on that Thursday, and I'd had a heart attack that Sunday. And they had to stop my heart so that they could get it started again so that it would slow down. Because he said, at this rate, you won't make it 3 days, your heart will wear out. And decided that I needed an ablation surgery done. God was with me again on this surgery. I'm Ken Stone, and God's grace is enough.